behind the grand walls of Buckingham Palace, where protocol dictates every movement and tradition governs every breath, there lived a man whose infectious laughter could break through centuries of royal formality in an instant. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, was not just a consort to the Queen or a figure of state ceremony. He was a father whose wit was as sharp as his military bearing, whose pranks were as legendary as his service, and whose humor became the secret ingredient that held one of the world's most scrutinized families together. When Princess Anne and Prince Edward sat down together in the quiet corners of Windsor Castle, away from the public eye and the weight of their royal duties, something magical happened. The formal titles melted away, the cameras disappeared, and two siblings found themselves transported back to a childhood filled with unexpected joy, clever wordplay, and a father who believed that laughter was not just medicine for the soul, but the very foundation of a happy family life. This is not the story of Prince Philip you've read in newspapers or seen in documentaries. This is the intimate portrait painted by his own children, memories so vivid and personal that they reveal a side of royalty that the public rarely glimpses. These are the moments when a duke became simply Papa, when the palace became a playground, and when royal protocol took a back seat to family bonds forged through shared laughter and unforgettable adventures. What emerges from their recollections is a tapestry woven with threads of wit, wisdom, and warmth that challenges every preconceived notion about life within a monarchy. Their stories reveal how humor became their family's secret language, how practical jokes became expressions of love, and how one man's determination to keep his children grounded created memories that would sustain them through decades of public service and personal challenges. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the oak drawing room at Windsor Castle, casting long shadows across the Persian carpet where Princess Anne and Prince Edward had settled into comfortable armchairs. The room, usually reserved for state occasions, felt unusually intimate as the royal siblings prepared to share something precious, their most cherished memories of their father's remarkable sense of humor, and adjusted her position slightly, a small smile already playing at the corners of her mouth as she considered where to begin. At 73, the Princess Royal had inherited much of her father's directness, but in this moment, there was a softness to her expression that spoke of deep affection and nostalgia. Beside her, Prince Edward, now in his late 50s, leaned forward with the enthusiasm of someone eager to reminisce about happier times. And began, her voice carrying that distinctive blend of authority and warmth that had defined her public persona for decades. Most people think they knew Papa through his public appearances, his speeches, or those carefully choreographed royal engagements. But the man we knew at home was someone entirely different, someone who understood that being royal didn't mean being serious all the time. Edward nodded vigorously, his eyes lighting up with recognition. He had this incredible ability to find humor in the most unexpected places. I remember when I was about 8 years old. We were at Balmoral for the summer holidays. You know how formal dinner could be, even with just family present. Mama insisted on proper dress, proper conversation, the whole ritual. Oh, I remember that dinner, and interjected with a laugh. You're talking about the night of the great mashed potato incident, aren't you? Exactly. Edward's face broke into a wide grin. Papa had been watching me struggle with the formality of it all. I was trying so hard to use the correct fork, sit up straight, make appropriate conversation. I was practically trembling with the effort of being properly royal. And then, when Mrs. Henderson brought out the mashed potatoes, those perfectly sculpted mountains she used to create, Papa took one look at my serious little face and did something that changed everything, and picked up the story, her own laughter bubbling up as she recalled the scene. He took his fork, scooped up a bit of potato, and, with the most serious expression imaginable, announced that he was going to demonstrate the proper technique for eating mashed potatoes a la royale. Then he proceeded to sculpt the most ridiculous little castle complete with moats and battlements, all while maintaining this absolutely deadpan commentary about architectural principles and the strategic importance of proper fortifications. But That wasn't the best part, Edward continued, wiping away a tear of laughter. The best part was when he declared that no proper castle could stand without being tested in battle, and he launched a tiny piece of potato across the table with his fork. It landed right in Charles's water glass with the most satisfying plop. The memory seemed to transport both siblings back to that evening decades ago. Anne's expression grew thoughtful as she continued. What made it so special wasn't just the silliness of it, though goodness knows we needed more silliness in our lives. It was the way Papa read the room, understood exactly what you needed in that moment, and found a way to give it to you without making you feel foolish or inadequate. That was his gift, Edward agreed, settling back into his chair. He could deflate tension with a perfectly timed joke, but he never made you feel like the joke was on you. Even when he was teasing, and believe me, he was a world-class teaser, there was always love behind it. And nodded slowly, her fingers absently tracing patterns on the chair's armrest as she delved deeper into their shared memories. I think people sometimes misunderstood his humor because they only saw the public version of it. In formal settings, his wit could be quite sharp, sometimes almost cutting. But at home, with us, it was completely different. It was warm and inclusive and designed to bring us together rather than set anyone apart. Remember the Great Breakfast Rebellion of 1971? Edward asked suddenly, and both siblings dissolved into laughter at the memory. Oh my goodness, yes, and gasped between giggles. That was entirely Papa's doing, and poor Mama never quite forgave him for it. Edward turned slightly in his chair, addressing his story to an imaginary audience as if sharing a treasured family legend. This was during one of those interminable summer mornings at Windsor when we were all feeling particularly restless. You know how it is with children, all that energy and nowhere to put it because everything has to be done properly and on schedule. We've been complaining about the breakfast routine, and added. The same thing every morning. Formal dress, formal seating, formal conversation. Papa had been listening to our grumbling with that particular expression he got when he was plotting something. The next morning, Edward continued. We came down for breakfast to find Papa standing in the dining room wearing his naval uniform, but backwards. His jacket was buttoned up the back, his hat was on sideways, and he was holding his coffee cup upside down. Anne's laughter grew stronger as she remembered, and he announced, with perfect seriousness, that since we were all tired of the usual routine, we would be having opposite-day breakfast. Everything had to be done backwards, or upside down, or inside out. The staff didn't know what to make of it, Edward recalled fondly. Mrs. Patterson nearly fainted when Papa asked her to serve the marmalade on top of the eggs and the eggs underneath the toast. But Papa was so convincing in his explanation of this ancient royal tradition of opposite day that even the most traditional staff members started playing along. By the end of breakfast, we were all walking backward around the table, having conversations that started with goodbye and ended with hello, and Papa was reading the morning newspaper upside down while providing commentary on the fascinating news from Australia, which he claimed must be having a particularly eventful day since everything in their newspapers was the right way up. The warmth in Anne's voice was unmistakable as she continued. What made it so wonderful was that Papa didn't just allow the chaos. He orchestrated it. He created this perfect bubble of silliness that let us all be children together. Even Mama, who eventually started giggling so hard she couldn't drink her tea properly. Edward leaned forward, his expression growing more serious despite the lingering smile. That was the thing about Papa's humor. It wasn't just about making us laugh, though he certainly did that. It was about creating moments of connection, times when the outside world and all its expectations just melted away and we could simply be a family. He understood something that I think a lot of people in our position struggle with and mused. He knew that maintaining our humanity, our ability to find joy and laughter in simple things wasn't a luxury or a distraction from our duties. It was essential to being able to fulfill those duties authentically. The room grew quiet for a moment as both siblings reflected on their father's wisdom. The afternoon light had shifted, casting new patterns across the ornate ceiling, but Neither seemed inclined to break the spell of memory and connection that had settled over them. "I think," Edward said slowly, "one of the most remarkable things about Papa was how he managed to be both intensely serious about his responsibilities and completely uninhibited in his enjoyment of life's absurdities. Most people think those qualities are contradictory, but somehow he made them complement each other perfectly." And nodded thoughtfully. "He taught us that taking our duties seriously didn't mean taking ourselves seriously. There's a crucial difference there that I think shaped all of us in fundamental ways. Remember the Christmas when he convinced us all that reindeer were just horses wearing very convincing disguises?" Edward asked with a renewed burst of laughter. "Oh goodness, that was elaborate," Anne replied, shaking her head in amused disbelief. "He had charts and diagrams and what he claimed were classified government documents proving his theory. Charles was probably 12 and still wanted to believe it was possible, so Papa kept the whole charade going for weeks. The best part was when he arranged for one of the stable horses to wear antlers during our Boxing Day ride. Poor Wellington looked absolutely mortified, but Papa maintained that we had successfully unmasked at least one member of the reindeer conspiracy. As their laughter subsided, both siblings seemed to settle into a deeper appreciation for the memories they were sharing. The stories weren't just entertaining anecdotes. They were windows into a family dynamic that had shaped their entire approach to life, responsibility, and service. "I think," Anne said quietly, "what I treasure most about these memories is how they remind me that Papa's greatest gift to us wasn't his wisdom or his guidance, though those were certainly important. His greatest gift was showing us how to find joy especially in, the midst of duty and obligation." Edward reached over and squeezed his sister's hand gently. "And how to create that joy for others. That might be the most important lesson of all." The conversation between the royal siblings had taken on a rhythm of its own, with memories flowing naturally from one to another like pieces of a puzzle coming together to form a complete picture of their father's character. As the afternoon wore on, Edward found himself drawn to stories that revealed Prince Philip's more mischievous side, the carefully planned pranks and elaborate jokes that had become legendary within the family, but remained largely unknown to the outside world. "You know what still makes me laugh after all these years?" Edward said, stretching his legs out in front of him. "Papa's ongoing war with the protocol department. They never knew what hit them," and raised an eyebrow with interest. "Which particular campaign are you referring to?" "There were so many." "The Great Name Tag Rebellion," Edward replied with a grin that suggested he was about to share something particularly delicious. "Do you remember when Papa decided that official state dinners would be much more interesting if everyone wore name tags with completely incorrect information?" "Oh my word, yes," and exclaimed, clapping her hands together in delight. "That was brilliant and absolutely horrifying all at the same time. Poor Sir Geoffrey nearly had a heart attack." Edward settled back to tell the story properly, clearly relishing the opportunity to share one of his favorite memories. This was during that particularly stuffy period in the early 80s when Mama was being advised to make everything more formal, more traditional, more proper. Every state dinner had become this incredibly rigid affair where everyone knew exactly where to sit, exactly what to say, exactly how to behave. Papa had been grumbling about it for weeks, and added. He kept saying that diplomacy was supposed to be about building relationships, not performing elaborate theater pieces where everyone was so worried about protocol that they forgot to actually talk to each other. "Exactly. So he hatched this plan," Edward continued, his voice taking on the conspiratorial tone of someone sharing a particularly good secret. 3 days before the state dinner for the German Chancellor, Papa announced that he was implementing a new diplomatic initiative designed to break down barriers and encourage more authentic conversation, and leaned forward, anticipating the punchline, even though she knew it by heart. "Tell him about the name tags." "Right, the name tags." Papa had ordered special name tags for every guest, beautifully calligraphed, very official-looking, completely legitimate except for one small detail. None of them had the correct name on them. Edward paused for dramatic effect, clearly enjoying himself. The German Chancellor became Heinrich the sausage enthusiast. The Archbishop of Canterbury was introduced as Dave from accounting. The Foreign Secretary found himself labeled as Princess Sparkles, defender of unicorns. And Papa himself, and interjected with barely contained laughter, wore a name tag that read Phil the Greek, professional husband and amateur philosopher. The beauty of it was that Papa had briefed everyone beforehand. Well, everyone except the protocol staff. So all the family members and most of the British officials were in on the joke. But he presented it so seriously with such elaborate explanations about how this was a new diplomatic technique designed to help people see past titles and connect as human beings, and wiped tears from her eyes as she remembered the scene. The look on Chancellor Schmidt's face when Papa introduced him to Mama as Heinrich the sausage enthusiast was absolutely priceless. For about 30 seconds, you could see him trying to figure out if this was some obscure British custom he'd never heard of. But then Edward continued. Something wonderful happened. Instead of being offended or confused, the Chancellor started laughing. Really laughing. And suddenly everyone else started laughing too. Within minutes, you had this incredibly dignified state dinner full of world leaders and diplomats all giggling like school children and actually talking to each other as real people instead of as walking emblems of their respective countries. I think it was one of the most successful diplomatic events Mama ever hosted, and reflected. Years later, Chancellor Schmidt told her that it was the evening when he finally understood what British humor was really about and why it was such an important part of our national character. Edward nodded enthusiastically. That was Papa's genius, though. He didn't just break protocol for the sake of breaking it. He broke it strategically, in ways that actually served a larger purpose. He understood that sometimes you have to shake people out of their expectations before you can connect with them authentically. He had such an instinct for reading rooms and understanding what people needed and agreed. I remember watching him at various functions over the years, and he could always sense when things were getting too stiff, too formal, too disconnected from any real human warmth. Like that reception for the Commonwealth ambassadors, Edward suggested, and Anne's face immediately lit up with recognition. Oh, that was masterful, she said admiringly. Tell me, you remember the story Papa told about the diplomatic penguin? Edward laughed, so hard he nearly slipped out of his chair. The diplomatic penguin. How could I forget? That was Papa at his absolute finest. He composed himself slightly and began to recount the tale. This was at one of those receptions where everyone stands around making polite conversation about trade agreements and cultural exchanges. You know the sort, perfectly pleasant, but about as lively as a museum exhibit. Papa had been circulating dutifully, doing his bit, when he noticed that one of the newer ambassadors was standing by himself, looking completely overwhelmed. The poor man was from one of the smaller Pacific nations, and added, his first posting to London, probably terrified of making some terrible social blunder that would create an international incident. So Papa wanders over, Edward continued, and instead of launching into the usual diplomatic small talk, he starts telling this completely elaborate story about how he once served on a naval vessel that rescued a penguin in the Antarctic who turned out to be a secret diplomatic envoy from a previously unknown penguin civilization, and picked up the thread of the story, her voice taking on an imitation of her father's distinctive cadence. And Papa told it with such absolute conviction, such attention to detail. The penguin's name was Admiral Wadsworth, and he was on a crucial mission to establish trade relations with the human world, particularly regarding fish distribution rights in the Southern Ocean. The ambassador was listening with this expression of complete bewilderment, Edward recalled fondly. You could practically see him thinking, is this real? Are there actually penguin diplomats? Is this some kind of test? What's the appropriate response to news about penguin foreign policy? But then Papa got to the part about Admiral Wadsworth's formal presentation to the Admiralty and continued, and he started describing the penguin's diplomatic credentials, which included advanced degrees in fish economics and international water law. And gradually, you could see the ambassador beginning to realize that this wasn't serious diplomatic intelligence. It was Papa being completely ridiculous in the most charming way possible. Edward's smile grew even wider as he remembered what happened next. And once the ambassador started laughing, Papa smoothly transitioned into asking him genuine questions about his own country, his own experiences, his hopes for the posting. But he'd created this atmosphere of warmth and humor that made the whole conversation feel natural and comfortable instead of formal and intimidating. Within 20 minutes, and noted, that ambassador was holding court in the center of the room, telling fascinating stories about his homeland and clearly having the time of his life. Papa had completely transformed his entire experience of the evening. That was what Papa did, Edward reflected, his voice becoming more thoughtful. He used humor as a bridge, not to avoid serious topics or responsibilities, but to create an atmosphere where serious topics could be discussed more honestly, where relationships could be built more authentically. And nodded slowly, clearly moved by the memory. I learned so much about leadership from watching him do that. People often think that authority means being serious and distant all the time, but Papa showed us that real authority sometimes means being willing to be a little silly, a little vulnerable, a little unexpected. He taught us that making people laugh isn't the same as making them laugh at you, Edward added. There's a crucial difference there. Papa could be self-deprecating and playful without ever diminishing his dignity or authority. In fact, his willingness to be human made people respect him more, not less. The siblings sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their own memories of their father's extraordinary ability to connect with people from all walks of life. Outside the window, the late afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the castle grounds. But inside the drawing room, the warmth of shared remembrance created its own golden glow. And said eventually, I think Papa understood something about happiness that most people miss entirely. He knew that joy isn't something that happens to you. It's something you create both for yourself and for other people. Edward looked at his sister with deep affection and admiration, and he created so much of it for all of us. Even now, just talking about these memories, I can feel myself smiling in a way that reaches all the way down to my core. That's his legacy, isn't it? And mused, not just the official duties and public service, though those were certainly important, but this gift he had for bringing lightness and laughter into spaces that desperately needed it. And teaching us how to do the same, Edward added quietly. Every time I'm in a situation where people seem tense or uncomfortable, I find myself thinking, what would Papa do here? And usually the answer involves finding some way to make people smile. As the conversation deepened, both and Edward found themselves drawn to more intimate memories. The quiet moments between father and children that revealed not just Prince Philip's humor, but his profound understanding of what each of his children needed as they navigated the unique challenges of growing up royal. These weren't the grand public gestures or elaborate family pranks, but the smaller, more personal instances where his wit became a form of guidance, comfort, and unconditional love. And shifted slightly in her chair, her expression becoming more reflective as she prepared to share something particularly close to her heart. Edward, I've been thinking about how Papa's humor evolved as we got older. When we were children, it was all about creating magical moments and helping us see the world as a place full of wonder and possibility. But as we grew into our roles, his humor became something different, more sophisticated, more purposeful. Edward nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the shift his sister was describing. He learned how to use laughter as a teaching tool, didn't he? I remember when I was struggling with that particularly difficult period in my early 20s, trying to figure out what kind of royal I wanted to be, what kind of man I wanted to become. The university years, and said with understanding. That's always challenging for anyone, but especially for us with all the extra scrutiny and pressure. Exactly. I was feeling overwhelmed by expectations, constantly second-guessing myself, worried about disappointing everyone. I think I'd gotten quite serious and rather gloomy about it all. And Papa, in his wisdom, knew exactly what I needed. Edward paused, clearly choosing his words carefully as he prepared to share what was obviously a deeply meaningful memory. It was during one of those weekends at Sandringham when I'd been particularly brooding about my future. Papa found me in the library, staring out the window and probably looking thoroughly sorry for myself. Instead of launching into some serious father-son lecture about duty and responsibility, he sat down beside me and announced that he had discovered the solution to all my problems, and leaned forward with interest, sensing that this story was heading somewhere special. He told me, Edward continued, his voice warming with the memory, that he had recently completed extensive research into the ancient royal tradition of productive moping, and that I was clearly a natural talent who simply needed proper training to reach my full potential. Despite herself, and burst into laughter. "Oh, Edward, tell me he didn't actually give you moping lessons." "But he did," Edward replied, his own laughter bubbling up. He spent the next hour giving me detailed instruction on proper posture for effective brooding. Apparently the shoulders must be at precisely the right angle of dejection. He demonstrated various facial expressions designed to convey different degrees of noble suffering. He even had me practice different sighs, rating them on their ability to communicate both depth of feeling and royal bearing. That man, and said, shaking her head in amazement, could turn absolutely anything into a comedy routine. "But here's the brilliant part," Edward continued, his voice becoming more serious. After we'd spent an hour being completely ridiculous about my moping, Papa very casually started talking about his own experiences at my age, the doubts he'd had, the pressures he'd felt. But because he created this atmosphere of humor and lightness, I found myself actually listening instead of getting defensive or feeling criticized. En's expression grew thoughtful as she recognized the deeper pattern her brother was describing. He disarmed you with laughter so he could reach you with wisdom. Precisely. By the end of that afternoon, we had one of the most honest, meaningful conversations about purpose and identity that I'd ever had with anyone. But it didn't feel heavy or intimidating because Papa had wrapped all that wisdom in warmth and humor. He helped me see that taking my responsibilities seriously didn't mean I had to take my struggles so seriously that they paralyzed me. I had a very similar experience, and shared, settling back as she prepared to offer her own story. "Do you remember that period when I was having such a difficult time with the press? This was in my late 20s when it seemed like everything I did was scrutinized and criticized. I was becoming quite bitter about it all, quite defensive." Edward nodded, recalling that challenging period in his sister's life. "The press could be particularly harsh with you, probably because you refused to play the game the way they expected." "Exactly. And I was letting their criticism affect how I approach my work, my relationships, everything. I was becoming hard and cynical, which isn't who I wanted to be." Papa noticed, of course. He always noticed when any of us were struggling, even when we thought we were hiding it well. Anne's voice took on the cadence of someone sharing a treasured memory. One morning, he appeared at my door with a stack of newspapers and announced that he was launching a new royal initiative called the Daily Ridiculous Review. He said that since the press seemed determined to write absurd things about our family anyway, we might as well learn to appreciate their creativity properly. "Oh, this sounds wonderful," Edward said, settling in to hear the story properly. Papa had gone through several newspapers and selected the most outrageous headlines and stories. You know, the ones claiming I was secretly training dolphins or planning to elope with a race car driver or some other complete nonsense. And he presented them as if they were serious news items that required our careful analysis. Anne's laughter grew as she continued. He had me read each story aloud while he provided commentary on the journalistic techniques being employed. "Notice," he'd say, "how skillfully the writer has combined complete fabrication with just enough real detail to make it sound plausible. This is clearly the work of a master craftsman in the field of creative fiction. He turned your frustration into entertainment," Edward observed admiringly. "More than that, he helped me see how ridiculous it was to let other people's ridiculous stories affect my sense of self. By the time we'd gone through the whole stack, I was laughing too hard to be angry anymore. And Papa had made his point without ever lecturing me about thick skin or not caring what people think. He showed you instead of telling you, Edward noted. That was so much more effective than any advice could have been. And nodded emphatically. And from that day forward, whenever I found myself getting frustrated by press coverage, I'd remember Papa's voice analyzing the artistic merits of whatever absurd story they concocted. It became impossible to take it seriously anymore. That's what I mean about his humor evolving, Edward reflected. As we got older and faced more complex challenges, Papa's jokes became more sophisticated tools for helping us navigate difficulties without losing our sense of perspective. He taught us resilience through laughter, and agreed, which, when you think about it, is probably one of the most valuable gifts any parent can give their children, especially children who are going to spend their lives in the public eye. The siblings sat quietly for a moment, both appreciating the depth of their father's wisdom and the skill with which he had guided them through their most vulnerable years. The afternoon light was beginning to fade, casting the drawing room in a softer, more intimate glow that seemed perfectly suited to these deeply personal revelations. You know, Edward said eventually, I think one of the things I admire most about Papa's approach to parenting was how he managed to prepare us for our future responsibilities without crushing our spirits in the process. So many children in our position end up feeling burdened by duty, resentful of expectations. But Papa made it all feel like an adventure and added, even the difficult parts, even the parts that required sacrifice or service to others. He helped us see that being royal wasn't something that happened to us. It was something we could actively shape and define for ourselves. Through humor and wisdom combined, Edward agreed. He showed us that we could take our roles seriously while still maintaining our humanity, our capacity for joy, our ability to connect with people authentically. I think, and said slowly, choosing her words with care, that Papa understood something about power and privilege that many people in our position never grasp. He knew that the real test of character isn't how you handle success or admiration. It's how you handle the moments when you're feeling lost or criticized or uncertain. And his response was always to help us find our way back to laughter, back to perspective, back to what really matters, Edward concluded. Not through denial or escapism, but through a kind of clear-eyed humor that helped us see ourselves and our situations more honestly. That's what I want people to understand about him, and said, her voice carrying a note of fierce protectiveness. Papa wasn't just funny, he was wise. His humor wasn't frivolous or superficial. It was one of the most sophisticated tools in his parenting arsenal, and he used it with extraordinary skill and love. Edward reached over and squeezed his sister's hand gently. And that's exactly what we'll make sure they remember. As the evening began to settle around them, the conversation between and Edward took on an even more intimate quality. The formal drawing room, with its portraits of ancestors and ceremonial furniture, seemed to fade into the background as the two siblings found themselves transported into their most cherished childhood memories. The moments when their father's humor became intertwined with life lessons that would shape their characters for decades to come. I've been thinking, and said, her voice taking on the contemplative tone of someone wrestling with complex emotions, about how Papa's humor wasn't just something he did for entertainment. It was how he taught us about resilience, about finding strength in difficult times. Edward shifted forward in his chair, sensing that his sister was about to share something particularly meaningful. You're thinking about the riding accident, aren't you? Anne's expression grew both tender and slightly pained as she nodded. Among other things, yes. I was just remembering how Papa handled the whole situation, and honestly, it still takes my breath away to think about his wisdom in those moments. The riding accident and was referring to had occurred when she was 14, a serious fall during a cross-country event that had left her with a concussion and several broken ribs. More devastating than the physical injuries, however, had been the damage to her confidence. And had always been a fearless rider, but the accident had shaken something fundamental in her relationship with horses and with risk-taking in general. Tell me what you remember about those weeks afterward, Edward encouraged gently. I was too young to really understand what you were going through, and took a deep breath, clearly preparing herself to revisit a difficult period. I was terrified to get back on horse. Absolutely terrified. And for someone whose whole identity was wrapped up in being brave and capable and fearless, that terror felt like a fundamental betrayal of who I thought I was. She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. Everyone had opinions about what I should do. Some people thought I should take a long break, maybe consider giving up competitive riding altogether. Others thought I should get right back on immediately, before fear had time to take root. The doctors were cautious, the trainers were divided, and I was just lost. Edward could hear the echo of that teenage confusion and fear in his sister's voice, even after all these years. But Papa had a different approach. Papa had the most unexpected approach imaginable, and said, a small smile beginning to appear despite the weight of the memory. 3 days after I was cleared to resume light activity, he appeared at my door with the most ridiculous riding outfit I'd ever seen. A helmet covered in stuffed animals, protective padding that made him look like a knight in very soft armor, and riding boots that were at least 3 sizes too big. Edward's eyebrows rose with delighted surprise. He dressed up as the world's most overprotected rider. Exactly. And he announced that he had decided to take up serious equestrian sports and needed an expert instructor to teach him proper technique. He was completely serious about it, Edward. He'd researched everything, different riding styles, safety protocols, competition rules. He had charts and diagrams and a very official-looking training schedule. And his voice grew warmer as she continued. But the twist was that he claimed to be absolutely terrified of horses. Every lesson began with him explaining his latest theory about horse psychology and his growing collection of safety equipment. One day, he showed up with a riding helmet that had a rear-view mirror attached. Another day, he'd invented what he called emergency dismount protocols that involved elaborate acrobatic maneuvers. He was giving you permission to be afraid. Edward realized, his voice filled with admiration for their father's psychological insight. More than that, and replied, he was showing me that fear doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of a different kind of courage, one that acknowledges risk but chooses to engage anyway. She shifted in her chair, clearly moved by the memory of her father's extraordinary sensitivity during that vulnerable time. Papa spent weeks letting me teach him to ride, and in the process, he taught me something invaluable about facing fear. He showed me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's moving forward despite fear, sometimes even with a sense of humor about your own vulnerability. And gradually you started getting your confidence back, Edward observed. Gradually, yes, but not in the way I expected. Instead of trying to go back to being the fearless rider I'd been before, I learned to be a more thoughtful rider, a more strategic rider. Papa's elaborate safety protocols and detailed analysis of risk management weren't actually ridiculous. They were genuinely helpful ways of thinking about how to pursue something you love while acknowledging that it involves real danger. En's expression grew more reflective as she continued. Years later, when I was competing at the Olympics, I realized that some of my best performances came from that combination of passion and careful preparation that Papa had taught me during those riding lessons. His humor hadn't minimized the seriousness of my fear. It had helped me process it and move through it. Edward was quiet for a moment, clearly processing the depth of their father's understanding and care. That's extraordinary, and he didn't try to talk you out of being afraid or minimize your experience. He joined you in it and showed you how to transform it. That was Papa's genius with difficult emotions, and agreed. He never dismissed or avoided them. Instead, he found ways to engage with them that preserved your dignity while helping you find a path forward. I had a similar experience, Edward said slowly, though mine was quite different. Do you remember when I was going through that terrible period of self-doubt about whether I was smart enough, capable enough, to live up to family expectations? And nodded with immediate recognition. Your final years at school, you were convinced you were the least intelligent member of the family. I was comparing myself to Charles and his academic achievements, to you and your athletic accomplishments, and feeling like I had nothing special to contribute. I'd gotten quite depressed about it, actually. Very serious. Very worried about disappointing everyone. Edward's voice took on the tone of someone sharing a story that had profoundly shaped his understanding of himself. Papa's response was to enroll both of us in what he called the University of Practical Wisdom. He announced that while formal education was certainly valuable, there were crucial life skills that couldn't be learned in any classroom. "Oh, Edward, what did he teach you?" And asked with growing delight. "Everything you can imagine, and several things you couldn't. We had courses in advanced pudding appreciation, which involved blind taste tests and very serious discussions about the cultural significance of different desserts. We studied international handshake diplomacy, where Papa taught me 17 different ways to shake hands and what each one communicated about cultural values, and was laughing now, clearly enchanted by the image of her father and brother engaged in these elaborate lessons. But the crown jewel of the curriculum," Edward continued, "was professional conversation management, where Papa taught me how to engage anyone in meaningful dialogue regardless of the topic. He'd set up these scenarios where I had to have interesting conversations with imaginary people. A stamp collector from Belgium, a sheep farmer from New Zealand, a jazz musician from New Orleans. He was teaching you social intelligence, and realized the ability to connect with people authentically." Exactly. And by the end of those months, I realized that intelligence isn't just about academic achievement or technical knowledge. It's about curiosity, empathy, the ability to make other people feel understood and valued. Papa helped me see that I had those qualities in abundance. I just hadn't recognized them as a form of intelligence. Edward's expression grew more serious as he reflected on the lasting impact of that experience. Those lessons shaped my entire approach to public service. Every engagement I do, every conversation I have with members of the public, I draw on skills that Papa taught me during that ridiculous but wonderful university experience. He saw your gifts before you did and observed, and he found a way to help you recognize them that felt like play rather than pressure. "That's what I mean about Papa's humor being strategic," Edward said. "It wasn't random or frivolous. It was always in service of something larger, building confidence, teaching resilience, creating connection." The siblings sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both struck by the consistency and depth of their father's approach to parenting through humor. Outside, the last light of day was fading, but inside the drawing room, the warmth of their shared memories created its own illumination. And said eventually, "I think one of the most remarkable things about Papa was how he managed to tailor his humor to exactly what each of us needed at any given moment. He wasn't using a one-size-fits-all approach. He was reading each situation, understanding each child, and crafting his response accordingly. That requires an extraordinary combination of emotional intelligence and genuine love," Edward agreed. "Anyone can tell jokes or be silly for its own sake, but using humor strategically to help someone grow and heal and become stronger, that's a rare gift. And he gave it to all of us so generously," and added softly, "not just his children, but anyone who needed it. I've seen him do the same thing with staff members who were struggling, with guests who seemed uncomfortable, with strangers who appeared to need a moment of unexpected joy. That might be his greatest legacy," Edward mused. "Not just the laughter itself, but the lesson that humor can be a form of service, a way of giving other people exactly what they need to face their challenges with renewed strength and perspective." As the evening settled around them, both siblings seemed to be arriving at a deeper understanding of their father's remarkable gift and its lasting impact on their lives. As night fell completely around Windsor Castle, the drawing room took on an almost sacred quality. The formal grandeur that had defined the space earlier in the day had given way to something much more intimate and profound. And Edward, having spent hours sharing their most treasured memories, now found themselves approaching the heart of what their father's humor had meant, not just to them as individuals, but to their understanding of what it means to serve others with authenticity, compassion, and joy. "I keep thinking about legacy," and said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had spent a lifetime in public service. About what we want people to remember, what we want to pass on to the next generation. Edward nodded thoughtfully, understanding immediately where his sister's thoughts were leading. Papa's public legacy is already well established: his service, his modernization of the monarchy, his environmental advocacy. But this other legacy, the one we've been talking about today, feels equally important. More important in some ways, and agreed. Because everything else he accomplished, all the official duties, all the ceremonial functions, all the public appearances, were made possible by this foundation of joy and humanity that he maintained through his humor. She paused, choosing her words carefully as she prepared to articulate something she had been thinking about for months. I've been watching William and Catherine with their children, and I see echoes of Papa in how they approach parenting. They understand that raising future royals isn't just about teaching protocol and responsibility. It's about helping children maintain their capacity for wonder and laughter even as they learn to carry the weight of duty. Edward's expression brightened as he considered this continuation of their father's approach. George, Charlotte, and Louis certainly seem to have that spark, don't they? That combination of natural dignity and irrepressible joy that Papa would have recognized immediately. Exactly. And I think that's no accident. William learned from Papa, just as we did, that humor isn't a luxury or a distraction from serious purpose. It's essential to maintaining your humanity while serving others. And shifted forward slightly, her voice taking on a more urgent quality as she continued. That's what I want people to understand about Papa's humor. It wasn't just entertaining or charming, though it was certainly both of those things. It was a form of leadership, a way of creating space for authentic human connection even in the most formal circumstances. Edward nodded emphatically. He showed us that you can take your responsibilities seriously while still approaching life with lightness and joy. That's a lesson I try to apply every day in my work with the Duke of Edinburgh's award and my other patronages. Tell me how. And encouraged, genuinely interested in understanding how their father's influence continued to shape Edward's approach to his royal duties. Well, Edward began, settling back to explain, when I'm visiting schools or youth organizations, I often find myself in rooms full of young people who are intimidated by the formal setting, by the cameras, by the whole ceremonial aspect of a royal visit. They're on their best behavior, sitting up straight, giving very careful answers to my questions, and smiled, clearly recognizing the scenario from her own decades of public engagements. But I learned from Papa that those formal interactions, while perfectly pleasant, don't actually accomplish much. They don't inspire anyone. They don't create lasting connections, and they certainly don't motivate young people to pursue challenging goals or believe in their own potential. Edward's voice grew more animated as he continued. So I'll usually find some way to break the ice, to create a moment of unexpected humor that helps everyone relax. Sometimes it's as simple as making a joke about my own nervousness or admitting that I was terrified of public speaking at their age. Other times, I might notice something in the room, a particularly creative project or an unusual decoration, and use that as a launching point for some gentle teasing or playful conversation. And what happens when you do that? And asked, though she clearly already knew the answer. Everything changes. Shoulders relax, smiles appear, hands shoot up with real questions instead of rehearsed ones. Suddenly, I'm talking to actual human beings instead of performing for an audience. And that's when real learning and inspiration can happen. And nodded with deep satisfaction. That's Papa's legacy in action. You're using humor the same way he did. Not as an end in itself, but as a bridge to genuine connection. I think about that a lot when I'm preparing for public appearances, Edward continued. I ask myself, what would Papa do here? How would he find a way to make people feel comfortable and valued while still maintaining the dignity of the occasion? And the answer almost always involves finding something to laugh about together and observed. Exactly. But it has to be the right kind of laughter, inclusive, warm, self-deprecating rather than mocking. Papa was a master at that distinction. Anne's expression grew more reflective as she considered the broader implications of what they had been discussing. You know, Edward, I think Papa's approach to humor reveals something profound about his understanding of power and privilege. He knew that his position gave him tremendous influence over how people felt in his presence, and he chose to use that influence to lift people up rather than intimidate them. That's a choice that every person in a position of authority has to make, Edward agreed. And Papa consistently chose connection over distance, warmth over formality, shared humanity over hierarchical separation. I remember, and said slowly, watching him interact with staff members over the years. He never used humor to exclude or diminish anyone. Instead, he found ways to include everyone in the joke, to make everyone feel like they were part of something joyful and special. Like the Christmas morning gift exchanges, Edward said with sudden recognition. Do you remember how Papa would always have these elaborate presentations for even the smallest gifts? Anne's face lit up with the memory. Oh, those were wonderful. He'd present a box of chocolates to one of the housekeepers, as if it were the crown jewels, complete with ceremonial unwrapping and a speech about the ancient traditions surrounding chocolate appreciation. And everyone would be laughing, but no one was being laughed at, Edward noted. The joy was shared by everyone in the room, regardless of their position or status. That's what I mean about his humor being a form of leadership, and said. He used it to create community, to break down barriers, to remind everyone that underneath all the titles and protocol, we're all just human beings trying to do our best. The siblings fell quiet for a moment, both contemplating the depth of their father's wisdom and the responsibility they felt to carry forward his approach to service and leadership. I think, Edward said eventually, one of the most important things we can do to honor Papa's memory is to continue demonstrating that humor and dignity aren't opposites, they're partners. That you can take your work seriously while still finding joy in it. And that laughter isn't frivolous, it's necessary, and added. It's how we maintain perspective, how we connect with others authentically, how we find the strength to keep serving even when the work is difficult or demanding. I want my children to understand that, Edward continued, his voice taking on a note of parental determination. Louise and James are growing up in a different world than we did, with different pressures and expectations. But the lessons Papa taught us about using humor to navigate challenges and connect with others, those lessons are timeless. And smiled at the mention of her nephew and niece. They're wonderful children, Edward. You can already see Papa's influence in how they approach the world. With curiosity, with warmth, with that particular combination of respect and irreverence that he modeled so beautifully. I hope so, Edward said softly. I want them to carry forward not just the memory of their grandfather, but the actual skills he taught us. The ability to find laughter in difficult moments, to use humor to make other people feel valued and included, to approach life with both serious purpose and joyful engagement. That's what legacy really means, isn't it? And reflected, not just remembering someone fondly, but actually embodying the values and approaches they taught us. And sharing those gifts with others, Edward agreed. Every time we use humor the way Papa did, to heal, to connect, to inspire, we're keeping his memory alive in the most meaningful way possible. As the evening drew to a close, both siblings seemed to understand that their conversation had been about more than just sharing memories. They had been engaged in a form of sacred remembrance, honoring their father by articulating the depth of his wisdom and committing themselves to carrying forward his most important gifts. Thank you for this, and said finally, reaching over to squeeze Edward's hand, for taking the time to really remember him properly, to understand what made him so special. Thank you, Edward replied warmly. I feel like I understand Papa even better now than I did before, and I feel more determined than ever to live up to the example he set. Outside Windsor Castle, the night was quiet and peaceful, but inside the drawing room where two royal siblings had spent the day honoring their father's memory, something beautiful and important had taken place. They had not just remembered Prince Philip's humor. They had understood it, analyzed it, and committed themselves to perpetuating its legacy of joy, connection, and service to others. In doing so, they had ensured that his greatest gift would continue to bless future generations, one laugh at a time.